In this lesson, what we're going to be doing is talking a bit more about the concept of dualism within the philosophy of mind, focusing on a different variety of dualism in this lesson, looking at the question of property dualism, which is, like I said, a different variety of dualism that seeks to address maybe some of the challenges that is presented by the previously aforementioned substance dualism, the sort of the theory that was most prominently promoted by individuals such as René Descartes, for example. And property dualism essentially looks to see ourselves as distinguishing between the different types of dualism to try and find answers to problems that might have been raised by substance dualists and substance dualism more generally. And so the first question I'm going to ask is, what is property dualism? How does it differentiate itself from the kind of dualism that we've already been speaking about, the substance dualism? Well, straight away, you know, as a result of the fact that we're talking about dualism, that there is a distinction here between the mind, the physical, and the mental, whatever those might be. When we talk about Descartes, he's talking about defining these things as different substances, hence why it's called substance dualism. Well, property dualism is a version of dualism that holds that there is only one kind of substance, okay, and that this substance will typically be representative as a physical substance. So this is where it contrasts with substance dualism, but rather than there only being one type of there's only one type of substance. However, there is still the sense that the substance itself, whatever it is, this single physical substance, let's say, will fundamentally have different types of properties. And that's where we see a distinction. There is physical properties and that there is mental properties, but there is only one substance, okay? So that's why we call it property dualism, and that's how we distinguish it from substance dualism. Descartes argued that there was a fundamentally different substance when it comes to mental substances versus physical substances. A property dualist might contrast that by suggesting that rather than there being separate substances, there is still one single substance. There is a unification of substances, but that substance has different properties. It is distinct from substance dualism because substance dualism posits this distinction in terms of kinds of substances, mental and physical. Instead, we say that property dualism argues that mental properties, such as consciousness, for example, such as thought, such as imagination, are non-physical properties that emerge from the physical properties, but are not reducible to the physical properties. That is the distinction that we see. And so when we think about property dualism, then, the mind is not considered to be a separate substance from the body or the brain. Rather, mental phenomena, so things like thoughts, things like sensations, like experiences, the aforementioned idea of consciousness, are instead physical properties that arise from the physical brain, but are not themselves physical. It essentially suggests that, rather where Descartes suggested that, well, if there is a mental and a physical, we've got minds, thoughts, and consciousness, for example, and then we've got sort of brain states and the physical processes that takes place within the brain, like electrical neurons and all this kind of stuff. Descartes argued that these are separate, and therefore they must derive out of separate substances. There must be a mind and a brain, and they must be separate things. And the mind is responsible for mental states and for those kinds of things like thoughts and sensations, and then the brain is responsible for brain states, the specific neurological the specific neurological phenomenon that takes place within the brain when these things happen. A property dualist suggests, well, there isn't this distinction here between substances. It all comes from the brain. It all comes from the physical, the brain itself. But the sensations, such as mental phenomena like thoughts, sensations, and experiences, or consciousness, are not physical experiences. These are instead mental properties. They include things like qualia, for example, the subjective first-person experience of things, and conscious awareness, which are seen as irreducible to purely physical descriptions. So you might be thinking, well, there's some similarities then between property dualism and substance dualism. A property dualist holds that the universe consists of just one fundamental kind of substance, that what exists is physical. I've written in their brackets usually physical because you can, theoretically, there's no reason to suggest that you couldn't have a property dualist who believes that the only thing that exists, the only property, the only substance, should I say, that exists, that is the fundamental substance of the universe, is actually mental instead of physical. You could argue that if you wanted to, but usually a property dualist will at least accept the proposition that there exists the physical. And so if you're a property dualist and you can only accept one, then you have to accept that it's a physical, then the physical exists, and the mental is derived out of, but not reducible to, the physical. This substance exhibits two different kinds of properties then. So, on the one hand, sorry, I just swallowed a bit of ice. On the one hand, okay, you have physical properties. And you see, that was a physical experience that just happened. Okay. Physical properties include things like mass, charge, motion, spatial extension. You can draw connections between this topic, like I said in previous lessons, and the topic that we've already covered, the subject of metaphysics, where we look at the idea of objects and properties, we look at abstract entities, and we look at the idea that an object, an entity, sort of has persistence through time and it has extension in space, whereas abstract entities like colour, for example, might not. They might be universals, or if you're somebody who believes in nominalism and predicate nominalism, you might accept a different proposition. So physical properties are the kinds of properties that will extend in space and persist in time. This includes mass, this includes charge, this includes motion. They are subject to the laws of physics and can be objectively observed, and they can be measured. At least if we try and just sort of like strip back some of the broader skepticism that you can have that sort of enters into the realm of metaphysics, or the skepticism that you can have that enters into the realm of the philosophy of perception, for example, where there is the debate about whether or not something can be objectively observed, or the philosophy of science in relation to physics. If we just sort of push that back and we sort of just focus purely on the philosophy of mind, we would conclude that physical properties are these kinds of properties that have spatial extension and temporal persistence. Mental properties, then, are, by contrast, subjective experiences. They are subjective qualia. They are thoughts, they are beliefs, they are desires, they are sensations. They cannot be observed externally in the same way that physical properties can. You can't measure a thought in the same way that you can measure, for example, an arm or a hand. Okay, they are different things. One is seemingly, according to this particular thought experiment, in this particular theory of mind, one is a physical property, the other is a mental property. Mental properties are not reducible to or explainable in terms of physical properties. When I explain physical properties, if I explained the properties of a physical object, like my arm, for example, I'm going to explain that by using and examining the characteristics of the arm, talking about the weight of the arm, talking about the mass of the arm. If you were being more technical and scientific, that you could talk about the chemical composition of the arm. You can talk about where it's positioned in space. It is positioned at the moment, as I sort of lean it here on the table, okay, on the desk that I'm working from. But you can't do that with thoughts. I can't tell you where a thought is other than in the brain, okay? And I can't exactly tell you the weight of a thought or the chemical composition of a thought. And so this is why we have a distinction between mental properties and physical properties in this regard. One of the challenges that a property dualist, though, has is, with Descartes, there was this kind of nice, neat conceptualization of substance dualism. It's this idea that, well, if the mental and the physical are separate, and I've just sort of demonstrated how we measured them in separate ways, then they must come from separate places. So the emergence of physical properties is different to the emergence of mental properties, or mental substances, should I say. But a property dualist has to reconcile the fact that the property is a single concept. It is a physical concept, or is a mental concept. It is not both, and that or at least the substance, should I say, physical. The universe is only made up of one substance, but that there are different properties that emerges from those substances. If, as most philosophers of mind would say, if they were property dualists, the substance that exists in reality is that of the physical substance, then we have to then explain where the emergence of the mental properties come from. Many property dualists believe that mental properties emerge from complex physical systems such as that of the brain. But once these properties begin to exist, they have distinct characteristics, and they are not reducible to the underlying physical properties that gave them their creation, their inception, their genesis. This is sometimes referred to as an emergent theory of property dualism. You sort of have emergent property dualism, and there are various examples that you can use to sort of illustrate this particular point. So, for example, although consciousness arises from physical processes in the brain, we can sort of determine actually at which point within the sort of development of a fetus that a subjective conscious experience begins to develop. It's around 20 weeks or so. And so even though we can't directly define what consciousness is and sort of solve the hard problem of consciousness, we can still nevertheless have an idea of what consciousness looks like, where consciousness arises. The idea of consciousness is that it comes out of physical processes in the brain. It has features, like, for example, subjective experience or subjective qualia. It is not reducible to purely physical explanations. But the question here is then, therefore, that even though it is emergent out of a physical process, it does not have physical explanations. Okay, so this is what this idea of emergent property dualism essentially seeks to explain. It is something that essentially consciousness, if we use that as an example, is a mental process that arises from physical processes in the brain. We know this by understanding neuroscience and understanding how whatever we define as consciousness, it seems to develop at a certain point within the development of a fetus in the womb, and that is obviously in conjunction with the growing development of the brain and the complexity of the brain as it develops within the mother's womb. However, its features are mental and are not explainable by purely physical attributions. And so this is where we get this idea of emergent property dualism.